have a little celebration of the Society's 50th anniversary in January as well. If you're not a member of the Berrien County Historical Society, we can take care of that. We have this nice form, and for the low fee of $20, you can become a member, and you will receive our publications and notifications of our meetings and all sorts of things like that. We are thrilled tonight to have Dr. Mel Stewart Hankla back with us. He was here a year ago in September and brought in a lot of people to learn more about his fabulous book that you can see back there on the back table, Into the Bluegrass. It's a fascinating book, so I would encourage you to take a look at that while you're here this evening. But we're going to have a slight, I guess, specialty part of your Dog and Pony show about Into the Bluegrass tonight, focusing on the long rifles of the Barons and some of those makers and so forth. So with that, Dr. Hankla, I'd like to.
You know, it's how's the sound? Is it okay?
I can hear you.
Great. You know, it's like coming home. I was born at T.J. Sampson Hospital in September of 1956, and I'm told I was one of the first C-sections they'd ever had there. So I don't know if they really damaged me or this is the way I was supposed to be. But anyway, it's really great to be here. I was here a year ago, and at that point in time, I was doing everything in my power to try to sell somebody a book. And this year, we're about sold out. We printed, I had an overage, I believe, of 170 some books, so we had 2,170 some, and we're getting up close to 2,000. So we're going to sell out, I would say, by the time Christmas is over. But the book's really not got anything to do with this, except this is really a double-page spread opening for a chapter that's in the books of the long rifles of the Barons. I just have got back from Pennsylvania. One of the things that the book has done for me, I bet you some of you have seen me do either Simon Kenton or George Rogers Clark with the Kentucky Humanities Council. I worked with them for 24 years doing these Chautauqua presentations. And I was pretty burnt out. I've done Simon Kenton over 1,000 times, and it got to the point that it was really quite a task for me to go and do these things. But the great thing about the book, it has pulled me into a lecture circuit, so to speak. And I just have got back. One thing I will tell you, there's probably people here that heard me talk last year, and tonight's nothing like what I went into last year. And I've actually worked a couple of days, and I don't mean all day long. But I want to, every time I give a talk, I try to tailor it to the audience and the region of where I'm going to be. And I gave a talk 3 weeks ago in Pennsylvania. There was an exhibit at General Hand's house at historic Rock Ford, and this was the title slide of my talk that was there, because all of the rifles that was in that exhibit were from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And really the whole brunt of what I was trying to promote at that one time is that the American long rifle, regardless of where it's made, is the backbone of our frontier culture. This is a copy of my book, Into the Bluegrass, Art and Artistry of Kentucky's Historic Icons. And a nice lady came up a while ago and said, tell me a little bit about the book. And as we go through this, it's impossible for me to not bring the book up and mention about it. But my goal with this book was to stretch a tapestry of Kentucky's cultural fabric. And some of you, I'm sure, are weavers. And if you're not a weaver, you probably understand that every piece of cloth, every weave has to have a weft. It has to have that thread that holds everything together. And my premise in this book is that the American long rifle was the weft of our cultural fabric. I also, with this book called the Historic Icons, I wanted to start and mention this. To me, these objects, they don't become cultural icons upon merit alone. They actually become iconic by their user, by how they've been used, where they've been used, and their impact upon our culture. And only then can they really transcend themselves and become iconic. And I'll give you an example of that. Here in Glasgow, in this area, the Settle family. Those rifles, from an artistic standpoint, are not iconic. But from a regional and a historic standpoint for Barron County, they're very iconic. And these stories, it's the stories. As you go through this book and you open it up, it's going to look like a picture book. But really, the book is not about the photographs that's there, or the icons, the artifacts that's in this book. It's all about the stories of their owners and their makers. And as I said, I wanted to stretch this tapestry of cultural fabric. And I contend that the weft is this Kentucky rifle. Richard Taylor, some of you may know Richard. He's a past poet laureate of the state of Kentucky, and I had asked him to write the introduction to my book. And he said, okay, send me the manuscript. And I did. It wasn't done, it wasn't edited, but I needed to do this so he could write this introduction to my book. And I must admit to you, when he emailed me back this introduction, I was overjoyed. Because you write, I'd sat at the computer almost 13 months writing this manuscript, writing this book, and I knew the message that I wanted people to get when they read this book. I knew what I wanted them to understand. And Richard got it. But one of the things that I'd never heard of, I didn't know anything about it, was this quote when John Adams wrote a letter to his wife Abigail in 1780, and he's in the middle of the Revolutionary War is boiling, and it's fixing to start. He writes to her and says, we must study politics and war so that our children may study geography and agriculture, to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, and tapestry. And it's this, folks, that's really worrying me about where our culture is and what's going on in America, because this has been forgotten. And he went on to say that at the core of a tapestry of culture lies the need for strength, security, and safety. And that's the thing that we're all wanting today. Every one of us, when we have these conversations about politics or so be it, it's about this. It's about strength and security and safety. And I contend that the long rifle is at that core, and it has enabled the flourishing of this nation. And this is the backbone of frontier culture. How many have this? Anybody have this lunchbox?
Once upon a time.
Walt Disney has made the Kentucky rifle famous in our lifetime. And it's through these kinds of things, it was, and throughout history, you say Kentucky rifle. Anywhere in the world, you go to Germany, England, Japan, and you say Kentucky rifle, and people know what you're talking about. They envision this long rifle with the patch box, maybe some carbon on it. And it describes this American firearm, this long firearm, but it doesn't have anything to do with where it was made. None whatsoever. As late as 2 weeks ago, there was an article came out that said this name, Kentucky Rifle, came from a song that was used by Andrew Jackson in his presidential campaigns called The Hunters of Kentucky. And it's talking and it's talking about, over on the right it says, but Jackson, he was wide awake and was not scared at trifles, for well he knew what aim we'd take with our Kentucky rifles. Well, little did this author know that he'd written this article, you're fine, that in the last year there's been a document found in Lancaster, PA, where a gunsmith there had written a menu of the different types of firearms that he built. And one of those was the Kentucky rifle. But you probably know that there's been one hell of a Cold War over the name of this firearm for a number of years. So, we have a challenge for the name. And this is actually a scan of the original notice that's in the Kentucky Historical Society that was sent to our governor from the Pennsylvania governor, Bill Scranton, in 1963. And it says, whereas the revered frontiersman Daniel Boone was born on the soil of the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and whereas the frontier weapon he helped make famous, the often miscalled Kentucky rifle, and more appropriately, the Pennsylvania rifle, first was produced by Pennsylvania gunsmiths. And whereas there is doubt concerning the fabled reputation of Kentuckians as marksmen, especially as compared with Pennsylvania marksmen. Now therefore, as governor of the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I challenge the Honorable Burt Collins, governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, to send Kentucky's finest marksmen to vie against Pennsylvania riflemen at the Daniel Boone Homestead near Reading, Pennsylvania, subject to the following conditions. Bill Scranton had only been inaugurated on January the 15th, so he's doing this in June. So he didn't waste any time to attack this name of the Kentucky rifle. This is what I just read to you. This is the beginning of the Kentucky Corps of Long Riflemen. I've got a good friend of mine, Richard Phelps, sitting on the front row. He's done more with his retirement than any human being I've ever known. He told me before he retired, he said, you know, I'm going to make that team. I want to be a member of the Kentucky Corps of Long Riflemen. And he's done it, and he shot with the team this year. This fellow here has been a big part of it. His family's been a part of it. And I guess what it had been your father was actually on this original team. I must say, and I can't prove this, but I feel it was somewhat of a publicity stunt, because we went to Pennsylvania and we shot and we whipped the Pennsylvanians by 27 points. Well, they immediately wanted to go double or nothing. Well, that was good, because in only 5 weeks later, we had the first Daniel Boone Festival in Barbersville, Kentucky. So they then traveled to Kentucky, lots of, you know, publicity about it, pulling people in, and we whipped them again. Well, Bill Scranton, being having the faith in those Pennsylvania riflemen, went to the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and he didn't tell them why that he needed to borrow this rifle. But it's dated 1815 and signed by J. Root. This rifle today is probably worth $35,000. And he put it up as a shooting prize, and he promptly lost it. And the first time that we find it behind the governor's office was with Ned Breathitt in December of 1963. And this is the last time that I can find a photograph of it behind the governor's desk. And it would have been, this would probably have been 1990. But really the reason that I wanted to put this slide in is this lady here is my grandmother, Pally Hankla. And she babysat Wallace Wilkinson, who was the governor when this was taken. Okay, we're living in this culture today. You know, I think we're kind of protected in this part of the world, but I give talks everywhere. And so often, you know, when I say I'm going to give a talk on the American long rifle, well, that's a gun. And this is what people think of. They think of this black gun. They think of these kind of cartridges. This is what I think of. When somebody says gun, this art, this warmth, these kinds of firearms is what I think about. And I want you to, while I'm giving this talk, I want you to think about that too. I'm on the board of directors of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Art that is under the auspices of Old Salem in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And they hired a new president and CEO about 4 years ago, and I will tell you he's now gone. But one of the first things he did is he closed their historic gun shop. And he and I had some real heated arguments about the American long rifle. And he called me about, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago now, and he said, hey, we're going to be coming through. I'm on my way to Chicago. I just saw it's going to be pretty close. He said, there's something. I'm missing something. This guy was open-minded, and he was as far left liberal as anybody I've ever known. And he said, I want you to give me a gun lesson. I want you to explain to me why you're so passionate and why you feel about these guns the way you do. So they come to the house. My wife, Angela, fixed a nice meal. We no sooner got eaten. He said, okay, I want my lesson. I want to know about this. So we went downstairs, and the first rifle that I pulled off the wall was made about 1760. And what I was going to do is start him at the beginning. I was going to start with this early rifle and bring him all the way up to, you know, the 1830s and 40s that we're going to talk about after a while. And he said, no, wait a minute. How do you load it? So I reach over and I get a powder horn in a bag, and I start to get the powder horn, and then I reach for a measure. He said, what's that? I said, well, you've got to pour this powder into this measure. He said, every time? I said, yeah, you've got to measure this in order for it to be accurate. And he said, okay, what's it shoot? So I dig back in the bag and I pull out this little round lead ball and I hand it to him. And he said, well, how many of those does it shoot? I said, one at a time. He said, you're kidding me. He said, how long does it take you to load this thing? And I said, if you're real good, probably a minute, 45 seconds, maybe if you're really humping. And he said this, then the Kentucky rifle should be recognized for its aesthetics and not for its deadly function. Its historic use and complicated mechanics of loading in no way relates to the reputation of firearms in today's society. I said, can I use that? And he said, absolutely. He said, it's true. But it was an epiphany for him. But you know, it was an epiphany for me too, because I had never had that kind of conversation with somebody that he'd grown up in Chicago. He'd never seen this. He'd never handled these rifles. He'd never looked at it that way. So it was really wonderful to have that experience. Folks, these rifles was the primary tools of the frontier. You know, I would have said if I was giving this talk probably even 10 years ago, at least 15, I would have said, well, the automobile is our #1 tool of the day. I'd say it's a heads-up match. Maybe the cell phone is our #1 tool of today, good, bad, or indifferent. These rifles put food on the table. You know, this fellow's squirrel hunting, and this is both of these drawings have been by David Wright, an artist from Gallatin, Tennessee. I'm sure some of you have met. That these rifles also protected the families. You've got to understand that the immigrants that were coming into America early on, 1770s, 1780s, all the way up, well, even after 1800, the majority of these people had never owned a firearm. In England, in Germany, for them to own a firearm was illegal. They didn't need it. They hadn't needed one. The game had been shot out. Only the wealthy were hunters. But they suddenly, once they got to America, they realized that they had to have this firearm in order to survive. So, friends, the Kentucky rifle became iconic by its dramatic impact upon our culture. These rifles are muzzle loaders. And I know this is going to be kind of below some of you's knowledge about these guns, but I wanted to kind of get back to basic about really what these guns are. They shoot black powder and these lead balls. And where in the world did they get this on the frontier? And again, I was talking a while ago, I mentioned the Settles rifles. You're talking 1840 and 50 and 60, right before the Civil War broke out. And it's a different time. When I'm basically talking about this, I'm talking the frontier. I'm talking 1780, 1790, and we didn't become the state of Kentucky until 1792. Black powder's pretty easy to make. It's 75% potassium nitrate or saltpeter, 15% charcoal, 10% sulfur. I'm sure some of you have seen this remnants of this saltpeter mine in Mammoth Cave, where, especially during the Civil War, the bat guano is where they were leaching this saltpeter out of the soil, where the bat excrement had left this. The woods were literally flattened by charcoal. And it wasn't only for gunpowder, but it was for making iron. You know, especially on west of here, and I live in Grayson, Kentucky, and around where I'm at, they literally cleared the forest because they were making these huge piles of charcoal that would go in the huge iron furnaces to smelt this iron. Sulfur is a common element. I grew up on Lake Cumberland, and I know when the lake was down, there was big veins of sulfur everywhere. This stuff was mixed up in a big water-powered mill. It's not really that unlike a grist mill that they would have used to make cornmeal with. And this is an artist rendering. You can see a little fellow standing over there in the back to give you some idea of how large that these wheels would have been. But they would have made these wheels out of wood to try to keep down this. And this is actually a fire in a powder mill in Philadelphia that happened in 1850. And there's a lot of documents of gunpowder factories. Even as early as 1760 in Reading, Pennsylvania, the Wolfgang Hankla shop said he blew the whole top floor off of a building where his gun shop was. So gunpowder fires and explosion were common. This is the way that gunpowder would have been transported at the time. You'll notice it says Kentucky Rifle Gunpowder, but if you'll look closer, it also says Hazard Powder Company, Hazardville, Connecticut. So it really didn't have anything to do with Kentucky, but still, this was made about 1840 or 1850, and it was the Kentucky Rifle. Even then, it was considered the Kentucky Rifle. But personally, you had to carry this powder. Every one of these guns, every firearm, this #1 tool of the day, it was worthless if you didn't have gunpowder. And they looked something like this. And most all of these early American powder horns are made from English shorthorn cattle because that's the kind of cattle that was being sent in. And I will say that this is a painting by Edward Troy of a real famous bull. I think the painting's dated 1834, and this shorthorn bull is called Kirkpatrick, and he lived just north of Winchester, Kentucky. So how in the hell you get them off? I bet you some of you fooled with them. I know when I was a kid, I loved to go to the veterinarian, and they dehorn these little bitty horns about this long. And I finally, somebody told me, well, you can boil them out. Well, Mom didn't appreciate that much. However, if you lay them out in the sun within 2 weeks' time, the core of these horns, as you can see, this shows it pretty good. This side of this cow's skull that's laid out and weathered, this side's still got that horn, which is basically like a fingernail or a thumbnail. But if you'll notice on this side, the core is already gone, and probably by this time you could grab this and it'd just come off in your hand. And it leaves a horn that's looking like this. In Philadelphia, by 1760, there was a whole section that was for horners. The horn was the 18th century plastic. And if you'll notice, this is, kind of a primer, a reader, if you will, that's been covered up with real thin horn. What they would do is take a large cow horn. They put this horn in tallow and raise it to 300 degrees, which is right below the boiling point of tallow. And it turns it into plastic. And you can take a horn and press it, put it under pressure, and the layers, the striations of this horn will come apart. And the other picture that was on that slide a while ago is a lantern, and it gets its name from lanthorn paints. We'll talk about those in a minute. But these are just a few items. This has been pressed out of cow horn. Of course, this cup has been engraved. This is a snuff box that's been made out of corn in the same way with a spoon. I'm sure all of you on movies have seen these big galleys on the backs of these ships. That's not glass. That's panes of horn. And it's called lanthorn panes, and that's where a lantern gets its name, because those early lanterns had horn as the glass, as the lenses that was in that. Most powder horns were utilitarian, very simple in design. I showed this particular horn because it's been attributed to Daniel Boone. It's come up missing, but still, I think in this book, I wouldn't put anything in this book without a primary document. I wanted to be able to do primary documentation that it was what it was. And I was within 2 weeks of the book going to print, and I knew I was going to catch hell because I didn't have anything about Daniel Boone. I've been to all of the museums, and this is Boone's and that's Boone's. I couldn't find any documents. And so often, even the characteristics of the piece didn't even fit the time period of these things. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I did find a trap and was able to do it. So next. The French and Indian War literally started a fad. And all the way through the French and Indian War and up to the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, engraved, decorated powder horns was the vogue. I mean, you wasn't anybody if you didn't have an engraved horn. However, there was a reason that you needed your name on the horn. This particular horn is on the table. But if you'll notice, it says William Fleming, his horn, 1782. Well, at the end of the day, powder horns were picked up by the ensigns, and they were taken to the commissary or to where the main powder supply would be kept, and the horns would be filled up. And if you didn't have your name on your powder horn, you didn't get your powder horn back. This is a wonderful piece. William Fleming was actually the 3rd governor of Virginia. And after George Rogers Clark came in and had all of these land claim cases in 1781 and 82 and 83, Fleming was sent in by the governor of Virginia and to settle all the land claim cases. On occasion, you'll find a rhyme on a horn. I'm sure some of you have seen this particular powder horn. It's at the William Whitley House. Sometimes, like right now, it's been taken back to the Kentucky Historical Society. And I don't think it's going to be on exhibit, but it's the kind of thing, if you wanted to see it, you could call in advance and they'd let you see it. But it's got a wonderful rhyme. I think I've got William Whitley, I am your horn. The truth I love, a lie I scorn. Fill me with the best of powder, I'll make your rifle crack the louder. See how the dread terrific ball make Indians bleed and Tories fall. You with powder I'll supply, for to defend your liberty. This has got great meaning because this rifle, that William Whitley's rifle, exists, and this powder horn exists, and they were new at the beginning of the War of 1812. We now know of 9 different powder horns. This thing is huge. It's a big horn. And for years, people would say, well, this is a supply horn. I'm here to tell you, if I'm going to ride from Kentucky to Chatham, Ontario, Canada, I want me some gunpowder. And there's 9 different horns now that we can document that was at the Battle of the Thames where Tecumseh was killed. And this in particular was one of them. And this brings me to the Tanzel family of Scott County, Kentucky. And Francis Tanzel moved in and got right outside of Georgetown in 1798. And the family left in 1828 and moved to Indiana. Francis was the father. His oldest son, John, was born in 1800, and it's arguably he may have been the best artist of the 3. Timothy was the younger son. There's probably, and I'm guessing you can't hold me to this, but I'll be pretty close. There may be 20 powder horns known by Francis. There's 2 on the table. There's probably 50 known by John. All of the rest of the horns on that table except the William Fleming horn are by John. And then Timothy was the youngest son. He was born in 1809. Basically all of his horns, I don't know of any horn that he made that would have been made in Kentucky. They were all made in Indiana. And kind of from my collecting focus, I've just really focused. But there's probably 300 or more of Tim's horns. And a lot of them were about the Black Hawk Wars, or they were kind of commemorative types of affairs. They're very recognizable with this kind of a well-mouth engraving where the neck of the horn goes into the throat of the body. There's a chapter in the book about the Tanzel family of powder horns, and there's never been anything published about these horns before. So this in itself, if you've got interest in powder horns, would be a great idea, a great reason for you to have the book. This is a John Tanzel horn that's on the table. It's dated 1821. And I wanted to show this because literally the engraving around this 1821 is the same kind of engraving that we find on the rifles. And there's one rifle in particular here that's got that engraving. And that brings me to the long rifles of the Barons. That's why we're all here and why I wanted to come and talk to you. As I said earlier, you know, the Settle family is iconic to this region. I don't know how many people have come to me and said, you know, I've got a William Settle rifle, and I've yet to see one. And I hope there's one there. He may not have signed his rifles, and his rifles would have been flintlock rather than the percussion Settle's rifles that we see most of the time. You know, he died in 1808 here in Barron County. His son, Felix Settles, there's actually the finest Felix Settles rifle that I've ever seen. Oh, it's a Simon, isn't it? I don't have a Felix here, but we've got the finest Simon Settles rifle that I've ever seen. It's the only one mounted in German silver. My friend Richard had brought it over, and it's laying on the table. Most of these rifles were very plain. They were working man's rifles. They were building them by the wagon load, and and literally them taking the wagon and traveling all the way to St. Louis and selling them there, and they were going up and down the rivers. Very, very popular gun, a very accurate gun of the day. Here's another signature. At the very beginning, when I said, you know, the rifles of the Barons, I'd never seen an original copy of this Munsell's map until about a month ago, and I went to a maps seminar down at Winston-Salem at the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Art. And this is Munsell's map that was done in 1818, and I thought it was wonderful because he lists the Barons. And I wanted to use a cutout because it's showing Russellville and Bowling Green. I don't even know, is Glasgow on here? Maybe we didn't get that much of it. But anyway, the rifles that I want to show you that I'm interested in my time period are all from either, you know, Glasgow or Bowling Green or Russellville. The first I want to talk about is signed Joseph Blair. It was made in Russellville about 1820, and it is just elegant in its simplicity. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1790. He was working in Russellville by 1820. The hardware on this rifle is iron. It's been hand forged. And in order to build one of these rifles, you had to be a good woodworker. You had to be, if you was going to use silver inlays, you had to be a silversmith. If you did not forge your iron hardware, you had to be a founder. You had to be able to take and make sand casting molds of a butt plate and a trigger guard, and then perhaps even cast out sheet that you could plenish to make the thimbles that holds the ramrod. However, I will say that by 1800 or 1820, he could buy most of that stuff, but he chose not to. He chose to hand forge his own mounts. Here's his signature. Again, the rifle is just elegant in its simplicity. And it's on the table. And after we're done, I'm trying to keep this slideshow somewhat short to where we can come up, and I have no problems. I'll let you handle this stuff. You'll have to be extremely careful. I'm like John Calipari, do it with two hands, you know, but I have no problems with your handling of these rifles. This is really the only carving other than some incised lines that's out the four stock. But again, it's just, again, elegant in its simplicity. Probably my favorite rifle that I've got on the table is signed I. McNeil. And the I and the J were both used synonymously. So really what this stood for was John McNeil. And this rifle was made in Bowling Green, Kentucky. McNeil was born in Virginia. Again, he was working in Bowling Green by 1820. He had two sons, William and James, and both of them followed in his trade. And there's more than one of these rifles that exist. But this rifle, I really enjoy this rifle because he's carried on these little horns on either side of the side plate we call Kentucky horns. And it started with the Bryan family in Lexington, Kentucky. And it seems like that it's been carried over all the way into Bowling Green. But this is called a captured lid. This patch box is also a carryover from the Bryan family in Lexington, Kentucky, that moved into Kentucky by 1780 and developed Bryan Station. And they brought this characteristic, this trait in with them from North Carolina. But this lock, this wonderful lock, handmade lock with I. McNeil and a gold, he was proud of this. I've never seen this mechanism. Most always there's a screw that comes through the top that holds this top jaw, that holds the flint into the gun. But he devised a cam-operated system with a turn screw. And it's just phenomenal. It's really intriguing. The last rifle that surfaced from this Barons area is signed A. Carnahan. Notice this patch box. And you heard me talking about the Bryan family. Andrew Carnahan was in Warren County. His dad was Colonel Jack Carnahan of Pennsylvania. But Andrew was in Warren County. I can't put him in Bowling Green, but I can put him in Warren County in 1800. He paid taxes then as a gunsmith. But the patch box is Lexington in design. However, all the other hardware on this gun, the butt plate, the trigger guard, the way he's done the tang, You know, and I said a while ago, you know, talking about these different guns. How many of you, if we were to leave here tonight and there was a 57 Chevrolet sitting in the parking lot, how many would know it? Well, why would you know it? Because of its architecture, because of its style. And you know the difference between it and the 57 Ford, and you wouldn't have to look and see if it said Ford on it or not. You would know that because we grew up with that. Well, these guns, the study of these rifles are the same way, especially these earlier guns that's made in the last quarter of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century. Lots of times, by their style, or the style of their parts, you can tell within 15, 20 miles of where they were made and within 5 or 10 years of when they were made, just by their style. But it takes a lot of study. You've got to handle a lot of rifles or look at a lot of pictures in order to do that. These 3 rifles were all made near Lexington, Kentucky. This rifle is signed Daniel Bryan. This rifle was made over around Lawrenceburg, and it's by James Searcy. And this rifle was made in Springfield, Kentucky by Reuben Mock. But if you'll notice, the patch boxes all have this design. So does the Andrew Carnahan rifle. Well, why is that? Did he borrow that? In the Kentucky Gazette that's published in Lexington, the Bryan families were advertising selling gun parts. They were selling, you could buy a kit of a patch box, or you could buy the patch box and the trigger guard and the butt plate and the thimbles. So they were selling these parts. And I'm not a lawyer, but if I was, I could build a pretty good case that this box was actually cast. It's cast brass, and that it was cast and produced by the Bryan family in Lexington, Kentucky. And that Carnahan had bought that from them and used it on this piece. Just a beautiful, elegant rifle. This rifle's seen a lot of use. There's a patch at this particular point in time, and I really think it's always been there. I think that when he was making this rifle, he has got into a bad piece of wood and went ahead and put the patch in. I think as time, it stands out more than it probably did when the rifle was first made. But still, this rifle is definitely in this bearing region of manufacture. As I started, when I first started, I made the comment that what I wanted to do was to stretch this tapestry of Kentucky's cultural fabric. This sideboard was made in Frankfurt about 1790 by William Lowry. I don't know who made the little sugar chest, but I'd say most of you understand that sugar chests are very iconic to Kentucky, some from Tennessee, but this is a little miniature sugar chest. This particular pistol belonged to William Crabtree, and it was carried at Kings Mountain. And Crabtree, after the mountain, he moved into Russell County, Kentucky, and it come out of the family there. This piece of pottery was made in Maysville, Kentucky by Isaac Thomas. The silver's got different makers. The silver pitchers by Asa Blanchard, Kentucky's most revered silversmith. I think maybe Thomas Marsh made one of the beakers, and a couple of them from Mount Sterling. The little painting is oil on ivory, and it was done by Matthew Harris Jewett, Kentucky's most predominant and most famous artist. The powder horn come out of Russell County, out of the Robertson family, descended in the Robertson family. And I cannot remember the lady's name that collected this little chair, but it come out of Lexington, Kentucky, and is of a style that we can attribute it to Lexington easy enough. And then hanging on the wall is a painting by You know, it does this to you when you get old.
Gets worse.
Joseph Henry Bush, and this is his niece Nanny. So this painting was done about 1830 in Louisville, Kentucky, by one of Kentucky's predominant artists. But I think you'll agree with me, there's nothing out of place. Nothing stands out. It's all a splotch of color. It's all part of this tapestry of Kentucky's cultural fabric. And the weft of that weave is this iconic Kentucky rifle. brings us back into the Bluegrass. Questions? Comments? I didn't do that good.
One of the things you brought up there about him having the different types of Kentucky rifle probably made to journey down the Ohio to the Kentucky country, I mean,
Yes.
down here.
Yeah. Well, that's what Richard was just talking about. This Kentucky rifle, this name Kentucky rifle, come from where it was being used. These rifles were being, you know, by the time we started coming into Kentucky in 1770 and 80, the Pennsylvania rifles had been being made for 30 years, and they were wore out. You know, it's not like today. You don't bring it home and clean it and set it in a gun safe. These guys were carrying these guns every day. And I know one of the highlights of my life was about 5 years ago. We rode horses through the Cumberland Gap, and it was a 14-mile ride. And we started at Martin Station, and we drove up and went through the, you know, rode up and went through the old gap and rode over the gap. I'm here to tell you the horse I was on was wore out by the time. I had no idea that the gap was really that steep, but we were all carrying rifles. And it was amazing how much wear that rifle that I was carrying had received laying over the saddle of that horse. So we don't think about those things. But these rifles were named Kentucky rifle because people were mad about Kentucky. I mean, you know, Ellen Esslinger wrote a book called Running Mad for Kentucky. And really, they were coming over the mountains, and at that time, until 1780, anything over the mountains was Kentucky, whether it was Ohio Territory, Tennessee Territory, even though all of Tennessee was North Carolina at the time, it was still, that was considered Kentucky. Questions, comments? Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to move to the back by the guns, and I want you, you know, feel free to come back. I'll try to answer any kind of questions that you've got there. And seriously, I mean, if you really feel like that you'd like to pick something up, we'll hand it to you.
Thank you all. Be sure and respect those guns and be not our horns and anything.
Absolutely.